can give me a hoy when you've started it.
Yep, recording started.
Thanks, Susanna. Well, welcome everybody to our lived experience policy conversation. I'm really excited to be here today, but I'm particularly excited to have our guests Greg Taylor, Kerry Dare and Nick McBride come to have this conversation with me. I wanted to start with an acknowledgement of country. So I wanted to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today in beautiful Lutruwita. But for me, that's here in Nipalona, Hobart, with the Muanina people of the Southeast Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. Wherever we are across Lutruwita, Truawanna, Tasmania, I acknowledge that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement and respect and a warm welcome to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are on the line today. I think it's particularly appropriate, given today's topic, to acknowledge that on a daily basis, the Palawa and Pakana people in Tasmania and all of this country's First People have had their lived experience and expertise systematically devalued, dismissed and silenced throughout the history of colonisation, and we need to do better. So, welcome from me and from TasCos. Thank you for coming. A little bit of housekeeping before we get to the good stuff. Please ensure that your microphones are muted during the presentation. That was good timing, wasn't it? And we didn't plan that ahead of time. But we're welcome to leave your cameras on where you're comfortable to do so that we can see each other as we have this online conversation. You're probably all aware of how to use Microsoft Teams by now, but just in case you've been using a different platform, to access the mute and chat functions, hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen or at the top of the screen, depending on your layout, and note where the chat function and mute function are. After a short presentation from each of our panelists, we will have a facilitated conversation. Please place your questions in the chat whenever you like, so that can be at any point. You don't have to hold them until the end. And then at the end of the presentations, I'll pose those questions from you to our speakers after they've presented. If I don't fully understand the question, I might call on you to unmute and clarify. And if we don't get to all the questions, we'll follow up afterwards. So just a note to Susanna, can you put the name of whoever asked the question in our document so I can call on them if I need to?
Yep, I'll just directly cut and paste.
Awesome, thank you. I am going to throw over to Greg Taylor from ATDC, who's going to do a bit of a topic intro for this session today. Greg, take it away.
Thanks, Lucy, and thanks to everyone for having me here today. I'm also coming to you from Nipaluna. I don't think we need a trigger warning today. I think mainly the focus is going to be on the advocacy work that people have been doing and some practical advice and thoughts around how we can not only listen to the people that our organisations are serving, but we can also involve with them and collaborate and empower them to have a platform. And that's what all this is really about at the heart. I think it's an exciting time in Tasmania for lived experience voices and an acknowledgement of people's expertise in something that they've been through. I know in the alcohol and drug sector that might be, for example, an experience of addiction, but also the experience of going through a treatment setting is a second type of lived experience and is something that is hugely beneficial if we can get those voices into the service design and delivery. So most of my expertise is coming from the AOD sector. I have a fairly good understanding of what's happening in the landscape of lived experience. This particular talk is born out of the TasCos Lived Experience panel from their conference in November 2021. And we had 4 advocates from different services speaking on stage, and it went down really well. And it was clearly an appetite for a follow-up. And so thanks to Lucy and TasCos for organising it. And I'd just like to acknowledge that our advocates today, Kerry and Nick, are going on the record, and it is quite a big thing because usually we can control the audience, but this is being recorded and can be accessed by anyone. So just thank you so much to both of you for speaking directly of your experience and advocacy work. And it's not gone lost on me what you're doing here today. So, and I'm sure everyone here would say the same. I'd just like to frame this by saying that citizenship and equality, respect and dignity and human rights are at the heart of all the lived experience listening. And we might have heard consumer engagement in some of our health services as well. I think we are moving toward lived experience participation now as a society, and it seems important that we always keep these bigger themes in mind along with the issues of the day being tackled. And I know in the AOD sector, stigma is a really big one, marginalisations of groups and power imbalances can develop really quickly. And all of these mechanisms of lived experience participation are just checking in with the people we're serving, and they're asking, is what we're doing equitable, is it dignified, and is it empowering? And creating these mini platforms within our organisations is well worth the time. It brings us closer to the people we're serving, and it's highly appreciated by our advocates. And I know many of the people involved in the AOD sector have gone on to peer work training, more advocacy work and training opportunities, professional development, different courses, and expressed an interest in being involved in giving back. So I think that's the way I'd like to frame the discussion today, and we might hear some stories and we might hear some practical advice on what's happening in Tasmania right now. And I also just want to acknowledge that there's lots of fantastic people in this meeting, and together I'm sure we'll get a really good picture. So feel free to contribute if you think that we have missed something. Thanks, Lucy. I'll throw back to you.
Oh, you're just on mute there, Lucy.
Okay, so I gave our advocates and Greg a warning at the beginning where I was like, don't forget to take yourself off mute because you look stupid if you don't. Anyway, here we are. So thank you. I'm going to ask Nick, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, thank you, Lucy and Greg and Kerry for doing this and for having me be part of it. And thanks, I'm sort of overwhelmed by how many people are listening to this. I think that's really a wonderful sign of things to come. Just to introduce myself quickly, my name's Nick. I'm working at comms and advocacy area all my life, but this is the first time I've actually been the advocate for something as part of Gender Equality's Advocates for Change. And it's fascinating being on the other side of it, I got to say. So my role is really to raise awareness of coercive control and experiences and behaviours to people who can make change in the system on behalf of gender equality and the Advocates for Change. And there's probably, I think there's about 25 of us now, so we're growing, and we're all pretty impressive, I gotta say. So I'll finish on that.
Thanks, Nick. Kerry?
Thanks, Lucy. My name's Kerry Dare. I have spent the last 18 months doing some advocacy work with the ATDC and also with TASCOS with their TASCOLAB project. It's very new to me. For 23 years, I was a florist, working in retail floristry, had my own business, and then a back injury saw me end up on a disability support pension. And yeah, this is kind of how I came to advocacy. Changing my whole career. Here I am. Greg's been one of the instrumental people in why I've kept going, I suppose. So yeah, I'll give you more about that later.
Thanks, Kerry. And Greg?
So my role at the ATDC is to work with our members, our member organisations, and some of them are in the room today, so hello to those of you. And so I'm working with our members to look at how people with lived experience of alcohol or other drugs might influence and determine aspects of service design and delivery. I've also been involved in the establishment of the Lived Experience Advocate Service, which is a live service now. You can see it on our website, and it's hoped that this is the foundation for an independent lived experience organisation that is for peers and by peers, so that the ATDC are the temporary custodian of that service, and then it will be passed to this independent organisation, hopefully in the middle of next year, if we get the money. So, yep, that's me, I think.
Beautiful, thank you. So we've got 2 lived experience advocates and 2 people in professional roles in peak bodies whose job it is to facilitate lived experience engagement. That's also what I do at TASCOS among various other stakeholder engagement projects. I also have experience of doing lived experience advocacy around sexual assault myself, and I think that this is a particular strength I bring to the role. But I'm speaking today with my TASCOS hat on, not my advocate hat on. All right, so we're going to kick off. The way the panel's going to work, just briefly, is that each person will speak for a few minutes, and I'm going to pose them a question. They'll give me an answer. We'll do 1 question for each of the panel members, and then we'll kick over to you for questions. As I said, pop your questions in the chat as we go, and then we'll come to Q&A at the end. I'll ask that we don't interrupt the speakers while they're speaking, and we maintain that conversation till the Q&A discussion time at the end. So my first question is for Kerry. And Kerry, I'd like to ask, what have been the most helpful approaches that organisations have put in place to support you in sharing your expertise as a lived experience advocate?
Thanks, Lucy. I've kind of split this up into 2 nearly. One is kind of the basic stuff. So I've kind of taken myself back to when I first started doing this, when I had no knowledge of anything that I was getting myself into. What were the things that actually mattered that organisations have put in place? So if I go back to really good basics, being given a really clear understanding of all the aspects of what an organisation wants me to do for them. So is this a one-off thing? Is it ongoing? Is it voluntary? Is it paid? How much of my time is required, whether it be within this environment where there's actually a presentation happening, or whether it's the behind the scenes prep stuff? Who's my staff contact if I need help? What's the purpose of my involvement? Who's going to hear me speak? Will it be recorded? Will it be made public? Will media be there? This is something that ATDC have done really, really well, and as has Lucy with TASCOS, knowing all those really good basics beforehand. And the other thing that they've also done is asking me what I need. One of the first big engagements I did with Greg was actually in Devonport. And as somebody with chronic back pain, the thought of getting in a car, and even just as a passenger, 4 hours in a vehicle, I hadn't done that for 3 years. So that was a really huge thing. And Greg said to me, what can we do to help you with this? A comfortable car was hired. We stopped. It's this 2-way conversation. It wasn't being done to me. It's being done with me. The physical space is something else for me. So parking, comfortable chair, taxi vouchers have been provided to me. One of the biggest things that Lucy's actually done to facilitate something like this, came around to my home yesterday and brought me the Wi-Fi modem, as hotspotting from my mobile wasn't working. As somebody who lives on a low income, I don't have extra money for extra bills like that, not regular things. So my digital literacy's increased. So all these things that these organisations will put in place as basics have now kind of been built on. And once somebody's comfortable physically in a space, then, you know, you become more mentally comfortable. And then it's kind of taken on another thing, other things that organisations have done. The really big stuff for me, I think, is having attention drawn to the structural inequities that have led me to be where I am today. That it's not just a matter of I've done XYZ wrong, so XYZ has been the result. It reminds me of ScoMo's, you know, you've got to have a go to get a go. Well, it doesn't always work like that. You've got to actually, somebody in that, you know, higher position of privilege and power has actually got to give you the space to do that. So I think people aren't being able to reach their full potential without having people like Lucy and Greg to do this. Being given access to something right from the start is mattering to me. So Greg talking about the lived experience advocacy service. Lucy will no doubt talk a bit more about TasCoLab. That's for an advocate being given access right from the start to this foundation building process. It's given me a sense of ownership. It's given me knowledge and information that I never had before this. Greg and Charlie from TasCos did a couple of workshops on bias and privilege, which I just think were unbelievably important. That's given me a better understanding of kind of the broad systematic forces that keep people oppressed and keep people from speaking up and keep people from wanting to do this. You know, we've got years of conditioning from stigma and discrimination, prejudice, you know, that teaches us that our opinions don't actually matter. So to then in the last 18 months have people saying to me, well, actually, you do have something to offer. This does matter. I just think that's amazing. The other thing that I will talk about just really quickly is training. For my, you know, last 18 months, my hundreds of hours of effort and work, and it's not normal work. You're not going for an 8-hour day. You're putting yourself on the line. What have I got to show for that in those 18 months is 4 days of training facilitated by the ATDC. So currently, I don't have any way of showing an employer what I have done by saying, here is, this corresponds to this course that I've done, so therefore I can do X, Y, Z. There isn't any of that, and I think that's where the sector probably really needs to go, is that we need a bit more formalisation of what advocates are actually doing. And that's pretty much me.
Thanks so much, Kerry. That was awesome. If you could join me in giving Kerry a round of applause. Thank you. So I'm actually up next. So I'm going to be a weirdo and ask myself a question. The question, we decided on these questions together, but the question we thought that I could speak to was what structures or approaches need to be in place within an organisation to support meaningful engagement with lived experience. And this, the focus of this question has been my role for the past kind of year at TasCos, or part of it. And the main message I'd like to get across is that the shift towards working with people with lived experiences from an organisational perspective is that it's extremely powerful, but it is slow and it requires careful consideration and resources. So Kerry has, and Nick will share some practical kind of do's and don'ts for kind of engaging lived experience advocates, but I'd like to focus on a slightly different angle, and that's that this work necessitates not only resource, process and structural changes for an organisation, and there's lots of advice online and frameworks around those sorts of changes, but I think something that people discuss less is the critical culture and mindset change within an organisation that needs to happen before this kind of work can get off the ground. You could put in place all the administrative structures to run an advocacy program quite quickly, but it'll fall flat on its face if there isn't a change in organisational hearts and minds to back this up. So as part of my role at TasCos, I'm currently facilitating TasCoLab, which is a new cross-sector collaboration trial where we're working on kind of wicked social problems in Lutruwita, and we're partnering with Aurora, Hydro, Tas Networks, so 3 energy providers, TasCos, Tagaralia, ATDC and Catholic Care from Community Services, and we've got 4 advocates from the community working with us, including Kerry. So the pilot project we're working on now is to co-design a formal community voice partnership program. So that's our version of a lived experience advocacy program, which will sit inside TASCOS. Our goal is to ensure that people living on inadequate incomes have a lived experience advocacy program through which they can feel heard and are represented in systems, services and decisions which affect them. I think that the cross-sector approach to designing this kind of program has been particularly important in bringing about a wide range of perspectives and expertise, and then we're currently going out to community and organisational consultations. So the organisations involved in TasCoLab, including TasCos, have been learning a lot along the way, and it's been really interesting for me to facilitate that and to learn from them and watch their kind of development as we go. And I'd like to share some of the key changes in mindset that I've seen happening within these organisations and elsewhere in the sector, which lay the foundation for meaningful inclusion of lived experience. So there's kind of 4 key things that I think are important in mindset change. The first is a focus on process as being as important, if not more important, than outcomes. So in an under-resourced, undervalued, overworked industry like community services, we're often caught up in the busyness of really task-oriented project work related to discrete pieces of funding that have specific tangible outcomes we need to achieve. But when we're focused on the outcomes, sometimes the process falls into the background, and when it becomes implicit, we rely on our implicit ways of doing things, which are familiar and often related to, you know, our implicit biases. And so I think that when we start working with lived experience, it's really important to actually focus on curating processes that are ethical and authentic, and where the process itself is as much a focus of the project or the work as the outcomes we're aiming to achieve. And you will achieve better outcomes when you focus on the process that engages lived experience. I've done it for the past 10 years and I'm constantly blown away by the outcomes that are achieved with this kind of collaborative work. The second, and this I think is one of actually the biggest challenges for organisations, is getting comfortable with uncertainty and risk. Many organisations are highly risk averse, and I understand that. It's also probably what I spend most of my time ranting to my partner about or wringing my hands over, because I think that if we're in a risk mindset and we approach stakeholder engagement as kind of stakeholder management rather than engagement and collaboration, we fall into treating people like tasks. It can become transactional and tokenistic. And so I think the reason we engage people with lived experience is that we don't know what they're going to say, and that kind of context expertise rather than content expertise is always an unknown when the people in the room don't share that lived experience. I've read something today that said that lived experience is something you can't learn or transfer, you have to live through it. So it's not a skill that you can develop over time other than to have a life that you experience and reflect on and learn to share. And so we can't know what people are going to say when we ask them, and that introduces a level of uncertainty that they'll say something that we actually find uncomfortable or disagree with. And I think that that level of risk and uncertainty has to be incorporated into operational approaches to engagement. Otherwise, we end up going down the kind of transactional route. The third point is that human relationships are key, and trust is key, and reciprocal vulnerability is key to trust. And so what that has come down to for me is that I've developed a really different way of being a professional for myself. Coming from academia, I hid my sexual orientation sometimes, I hid my disability all the time. I never fronted up and said, I'm a queer disabled woman and I'm also an academic. In this space, I feel that it's inauthentic for people like Nick and Kerry to turn up and say, I've got this experience of my life, and then I get to sit behind a professional veneer that protects me from being honest and vulnerable. And when I hear people say things like, oh, we have to practice radical empathy in the legal profession, or oh, we have to practice radical kindness as academics, and I'm like, have human traits really become so alien from professional contexts that we have to radicalize them in order to bring them back. And so I do think that if you're a professional engaging like regularly with lived experience advocates, my approach and the way that I feel I can do this work authentically is to bring my whole self to the work. And that means being vulnerable in professional spaces. So the last one, the fourth point, is questioning the status quo. I did the Enneagram recently, and for those of you who know me, you'll probably not be surprised to hear that I got the challenger was my personality type. Maybe that's why I end up in roles like this, but I spend a lot of my time questioning why is it done this way? And if the answer is it's always been done that way, then I think we need to reconsider. And a lot of this engagement with lived experience requires different approaches to engagement, and the ways that have always been done are the ways that exclude and silence people from marginalised backgrounds or who have been excluded or stigmatised. And so if we continue to do them that way, then we're not doing the lived experience advocates and the work that they do justice. So I think one of the kind of structural things coming into organisations learning to do this is getting comfortable with discomfort and being able to question the assumptions behind our operating procedures and being willing to have those conversations that might not always be easy. And I think that ultimately it's a benefit to the organisation because it pushes us to evolve over time for this, but also for, you know, broadly being more inclusive of diverse perspectives. So that's me. What am I going to do next is, let me just pull up my run sheet here. I'm going to go over to Nick, and I'm going to ask Nick, what are some of the risks or challenges you face as a lived experience advocate, and what advice would you give to organisations in terms of preventing these?
Okay, I'm going to start off topic because thank you so much for what you just said there, Lucy. You actually just validated my approach to being a professional in a workplace there, and I appreciate it because yeah, it's too much effort to pretend to be something you're not, and it's so much easier to do a great job when you're yourself at work as well as like you're the same person at work and at home. So thank you for that. Back on topic a little more. Yeah, I mean, the risks, etc. A lot of what Kerry said goes to minimising the practical risks and things for advocates personally when they take part in things like this. There's a lot of risks around how small a place it is here, as far as my experience goes, being in the family violence area. I have to be very careful about who I'm talking to and what the networks are, etc., etc. And that's for me to worry about, but it's something to be respected as well by the people who ask me to do things with them. And the other part is that it's exhausting, but both beforehand and afterwards, for me anyway, as an advocate. It means I have to open up a box in my head that I don't always have open. And the effort of doing that and then putting the lid back down can be quite tricky. Clearly I choose to do it, I want to do it, but the awareness and respect of people asking me to do these things and they're checking in with me is really important to minimizing that risk, and for me remaining self-aware as far as, am I tired from doing this, or is it something I shouldn't be doing in the end? So I have to keep reevaluating that, and having people like Greg and Lucy to support that mindset is really important, I think. The more, I mean, I was thinking about this, trying to think of practical tips and tricks that you could use, but I think it all boils down to one really core thing when you're working with people in this space, is that, especially as someone whose area is coercive control, is the most powerful thing you can do for an advocate is tell them they're in control and actually practically make sure they are in control and that they know that. Like I still, when I hear journalists interviewing people with lived experience, I can, and you can, even this morning, I just heard someone in Ukraine being interviewed, you know, and they were falling apart. I mean, you can imagine. And I just was dying for the journalist to say, actually, you don't have to tell me anymore. If you've had enough, you're actually in control of this. And if you need to stop, just say so. But they pushed them. They were nice, but they pushed them. And I thought, that's not okay, I think. I mean, that's obviously a very hard situation, but I find a lot of the safety I get is in knowing that in gender equality is absolutely fine with me 1 minute after I'm supposed to start saying, actually, I can't do it. I can't do it today. And they don't ask why. They just say, are you okay? What can we do for you? We'll take care of letting people know, and we'll get in touch soon after to make sure you're all right. So to me, having worked in communications and media for the last 25 years, that to me, that's like risk right there. Is you're asking someone to do something publicly that you can't depend on them actually doing. And so if I was organizing an event, I'd be like, whoa, I don't want to ask the person who I have to be okay with them canceling at the last second. And yet I think that's a really rich part of this, is that it's not transactional, just like you said, Lucy. It's not a transactional arrangement. You're actually committing to care for this person's requirements and for to allow them to control what's going on. And so if that means your panel loses a person at the last minute, then you actually need to be okay with that and use that as possibly part of what you discuss in the panel. So I think, yeah, sorry, I'm kind of rabbiting on, but I'm trying to say that I really think in many ways, being in control of the situation after you've been through something like I have is the most powerful thing you can do for me. And I see that need both in the systems we're trying to change. We need to flip them so that the person who's battled to come out of a family violence situation is in control of what's going on afterwards, and the same with this sort of thing. So I feel like no one's making me do anything. Nobody's making me feel uncomfortable. I can make my own decisions. And I think you can't underestimate how powerful a risk that is to take with someone. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Nick. A round of applause for Nick as well. And Greg, last but not least, what's the lay of the land in the community services industry currently in terms of lived experience advocacy, and what directions do you think the industry needs to go in the future?
In terms of formal consumer rep services, that's fee for service. So if you want to get a voice in for a dollar amount, there are a few. So our lived experience advocate service is one of those. In the mental health space, there's Flourish run a consumer rep service as well, and so do Mental Health, Family and Friends. We also have in gender equality in the family violence space, and I understand, I know Maddie is in the audience here, but Health Consumers Tasmania also have a fee for service structure. I think that's it in Tasmania from what I know, but there might be others. And I know that there are a lot of independent organisations that provide that voice as well. So Working It Out or Disability Voices Tasmania might be two good examples of that. I think that's it, unless anyone else has one to add. The second part of the question, what's in the future, or what do I think is in the future? I did an audit or a review of the alcohol and drug sector in 2021, so I was able to visit 11 of our treatment or support settings in the space. And for those that are in the audience today, I thank you again for having me in. Some of the things that I discovered were that the attitudes toward this is very, very good. And in terms of the staff wanting this, everybody does really want it and the goodwill is there. Where it's not happening perfectly is not having the luxury of people in Lucy or my position where it's a designated staff position, or even you know, within a position description for a staff member to coordinate these activities. So that is a huge luxury that we have, and a lot of our AOD support services don't have that. So the approach is a little bit more off the side of the desk and it might not have structure. For some of the larger support services in our sector, there might be a consumer reference group, and these are really excellent by design. So this is a group that would meet periodically. People who are accessing the service who get to have a voice, a collective voice, and then that travels up to the Board of Governance and might result in a change of policy or a change in strategic direction. How those work in practice is potentially different. It's something that I've heard, and there's usually a low awareness even among staff that these exist because the organisation is quite big. They might have thousands of employees. So, and for people accessing the services, it might be mysterious how to become involved in that. So also there's a possible reliance on the same cohort of consumers or people with lived experience to provide their perspectives. And with COVID, there was uncertainty about the regularity of those meetings. So the consumer reference group is a great mechanism, but it was actually potentially not as good as in practice. So that was one thing that I've heard. In terms of things that are aspirational in this space, one thing that Kerry mentioned was accredited training. Having an accredited training is really important. If we invent programs of training, but they don't really have a currency outside our organisation or sector or state, it doesn't always serve the people who have invested their time in it. And it doesn't have any objective value, perhaps. Another thing that came up was realistic pathways to employment. Are there going to be positions available at the end of the training? Was a really clear question. Is there budget for that? Is there clarity around how organisations can host people with lived experience in these new roles, how they might work alongside clinical staff, because it's, of course, in our sector, it's got to be safe, number one. Another theme that came up was how we might be able to acknowledge lived experience as a qualification. And a lot of people suggested that that would be enough for a role. So that's probably one for the people here today to discuss if they consider. A final, very practical thing for anyone at the executive level in the audience today was we all probably operate under funding agreements, and we might have deliverables or KPIs there. The next time that's up for review, a great suggestion has been, why don't we run a lived experience lens over those KPIs, because sometimes they're just rolled over blindly and we might be able to take out something that's outdated and put something in there. So suddenly, if it's in the funding agreement, guess what? It becomes a priority for the organisation, and it really does start to change and empower, and the people that are accessing the service can get a voice and a mini platform finally, in the alcohol and drug space, I guess we are creating these temporary structures or occasional structures, but we really would love to have a legitimate platform for people with lived experience to have their own organisation. So that's like the number one thing that we're driving for in our sector, and I hope that we can get that within the next couple of years. So that's my understanding of the future and where we might be able to go, and hopefully some practical tips that you might be able to carry back to your organisations.
Great. Thanks for that. That was excellent. A round of applause for our last speaker. Okay, so I've got some questions coming up here. The first one looks to me to be from, and some great contributions, which I encourage you to read. So if you've got questions, pop them in the chat. The first one's from Matty Wright from Health Consumers, and they ask, Lucy, sometimes other professionals look at me funny when I'm vulnerable. How do you think this way of working can be systematically supported? Yes, Matty, lots of funny looks or discomfort, absolutely. In terms of systematically supported, honestly, the thing that helps me most is when leadership actually do this. Like Charlie, my manager, once said in a TAS Collab meeting, look, I've just had some really difficult news about my daughter. My head's all over the place. I'm not really like on the ball today, so can you bear with me? And so I think that kind of cultural change towards bringing our whole selves to professional contexts, it's not really something you can write into policy. I guess you could put it into like cultural frameworks for organizations, but honestly the best way I think is by doing it and continuing to do it, and just putting up with the funny looks or going, hey, you've given me a funny look, what's that about, you know, and opening up those conversations, because it's, I guess, like osmosis or diffusion. I think it just passes, and I have had people in TASCOS, you know, like Susanna once, I said, how are you doing? And she said, I'm fine. And then she said, well, actually, I'm not that fine today, and I don't feel like I can be like inauthentic around you. And like for me, that's the biggest compliment, because it tells me that my radical authenticity is spreading, and other people get to the point where hopefully we can all just be authentic without it being radical. Another question is from Stephen Hill. What could be some of the strategies around managing the context of advocacy being physically, mentally, and emotionally exhausting in a manner that continues to value the role and doesn't remove empowerment and independence? Whew. Could be. I'm gonna pass. See if Kerry, do you want to have a crack at this one?
Can you just repeat it for me?
Yeah, so it's around alleviating and managing the physical, mental, and emotional toll that advocacy takes on people in a way that doesn't remove empowerment and independence.
For me personally, it's been getting space from the things that I'm talking about. So if I was smack bang in the middle of it, you would not see me for dust. I would not be here. I would not be speaking. I've got to have processed it myself before I can pass anything that I've got onto anybody else. And to process it, you know, I need people like Lucy, and I need people like Greg. I need my counsellor. I need my music. I need my piano playing. I need my garden. I need my dog. I need my family and friends. So this self-awareness of what it does take out of you, when Nick was talking about, you know, opening these boxes in your head and what that toll is like, it's not just this hour of presenting, and it's not just the hour of prep work that we did. It's so much more than that. And without those other things in my life, other than advocacy, I'd really struggle, I think.
Nick, so, yeah. Do you have anything to add to that?
I did, yeah. Thank you for saying that, Kerry. And I think too, like that's absolutely vital. You can't be in the middle of it. I mean, I was lucky I got dressed and showered when I was in the middle of it. So I don't think there was much of a chance. But Yeah, I think it's, I know it sounds kind of throwaway, but I think it's that open acknowledgement that it does take a toll is enough to in some ways, at least make you comfortable with the fact that you need to relax and do something else afterwards, and that you know someone's is thinking about the fact that it's going to be hard for you. I think in many ways that's enough. The pretense of being okay is one of the most exhausting things ever. So if you can just avoid that and constantly check in, I think that's as valuable as anything else.
And I think probably we can kind of systematize that into policies and procedures around like lived experience programs. So like if I have a checklist of things to follow up on after an advocate has shared their story, I might include in that, what have you done to celebrate your experience? What have you done to do some self-care? Like we can put that stuff down on paper because we know it's so important. So I think there's some strategies around managing that can definitely be put into our procedures for this work. Catherine, your question, as always, has done my head in a little bit. It's always nuanced and beautiful. So I'm going to actually ask you to come off mute and just can you pose that to us?
Yeah, I guess I'm really interested in this tension between the kind of professional advocate category, which I sit in myself, and that of the kind of lived experience advocate, and the idea that kind of sits weirdly with me that somehow those with lived experience need to be trained in how to share their lived experience. And, you know, in many ways, of course, there's so much that's positive about that because it comes with support and acknowledgement and all the other things that people were talking about. But it's sort of like this you know, class consciousness that needs to be raised by the intellectual classes in the downtrodden. You know, that there's this that's sitting there for me. But on the other hand, there's an enormous kind of sense of power in that collaboration that holds and shares some of the emotional weight of what those with lived experience of a particular issue may be experiencing. Yeah, sorry, I'm not even quite sure where I'm going with that, but it's just a really interesting tension that's coming out both in the chat and in what people have talked about. And it's something I struggle with, you know, in my role as a professional advocate, you know, really trying to hold up lived experience, working with lived experience, but also knowing, you know, at the end of the day, for example, in my area of homelessness, you know, the difficult point that comes when somebody says, I actually love being homeless. I love it. I'm free. Or, you know, something like that. And then you're like, oh, no, but like we're supposed to be on this message of like homelessness is terrible. We need social housing. Like you cannot say that, you know. Anyway, for whatever that is.
Nick, do you want to
how it comes out?
have a crack?
Yeah,
thanks, Catherine.
Yeah, I can't solve that, but what I would contribute is this, that I think training's probably not the greatest word for what is actually done. At least what I experienced with in gender equality, yeah, I'd call it a training package. It was 4 intense days with some beautiful people, but it was less about training me on how to share my lived experience and more about focusing on getting what you wanted out of what you shared. So it's about being clear, knowing how to protect yourself, then that you don't have to tell details to get your passion and your emotion across, that they're just there. So they're going to come out when you're, you know, making your messages. And I think that helped because it was so, the emotions are so big. It helped a lot to have not only that support, obviously, but just that sense of when you're talking to people, if you really want to be get your point across, here's just some frameworks you can count on. So like this, I mean, like I said, I'm in comms for 25 years, but I still this morning went to my huge notebook from in gender equality and went, okay, what are the what's the framework of what I'm trying to say today, so that I can take it down to a scope I can deal with emotionally and intellectually. So yeah, I think training's a bad word for it, to be honest, because it makes it sound like you're learning how to serve a hamburger or something when it's so much more nuanced than that. Yeah.
Thanks, Nick. Yep, Greg?
I think one of the common criticisms of consumer engagement has been the myth of the difficult consumer. So people just get a bit frustrated if someone flies off the handle, but maybe it's just a matter of the person that came in the room wasn't briefed properly, wasn't prepared, didn't have clarity about the things they would talk about. Maybe they left and the things that they said had no perceivable influence and they thought that it was really going to count for something. So I think just reiterating what Kerry said about providing absolute clarity to people for each engagement is really key. Also, something that's resonating with me is something that Matty Wright, when he was at Disability Voices Tasmania, said, and I've heard again and again, and I think, Matty, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you went through training with Rodney Croom and Robin Banks and learned a way to harness your voice and speak from the scar, not the wound, so it actually wasn't re-traumatizing every time you had to open your mouth. And I think that is the kind of training that's really, really helpful. And I've since spoken to Rodney about that, and I know that he offers this kind of training through the Ingalls Clarke Centre for Human Rights and Democracy, which you can look up. And there's a lot of wonderful modules there if you would like to connect people that you know with that training. And he is just so experienced at working with people to get their objectives down and not go off in tangents. And that is actually really important for staying on point. So what are we going in the room to get done today? Do I have to speak by myself? Will I have people at my back? Will I be the only voice of lived experience in this room? Just those kinds of things are really the things that we can control those things because we're designing the engagements a lot of the time. A lot of this time, these things are not co-designed. So we still have, there's an immediate power imbalance there every time. So there are a few of my thoughts on what both Catherine and Stephen raised.
Thanks, Greg. And I also think that a lot of the kind of informal training that I do with lived experience advocates is just confidence building and positive affirmation. Kerry's like, can I say that? And I'm like, hell yeah, you can say that. That's what you're there for. You know, like it's really encouragement and validation and checking in. And I think that's all part of the process. We've got time for one more quick question, which I might kick to Greg for. Have ATDC or TasCoLab looked at processes around support for audience members who may be triggered when listening to stories? From Helen. Greg, any thoughts on that?
I think we always try to give a trigger warning. There's not too many cases, Helen, where someone's actually going to talk about their direct lived experience from the ATDC. Quite often the gigs are around sitting on staff recruitment interview panels or things like that. So I know that Kerry did talk directly about her lived experience a couple of times, and we did give a trigger warning there. So, but I'm not the direct supervisor of the lived experience advocate service, so I don't know if it's in the policy yet. So really good question. Thank you.
Yeah. From my end, it's about those trigger warnings and also about saying if you need to leave, don't feel uncomfortable about it. Make sure that if anything is upsetting, practice self-care, giving people permission to be human in those spaces again, and practice some radical self-compassion and do what they need to do so that they're not sitting there being triggered but being really worried that if they leave someone will get offended. So yeah, opening up that space for being a place for self-care and self-compassion I think is also really important. Yeah, So we're 2 minutes out. I'm going to say a big thank you to Nick McBride, Kerry Dare and Greg Taylor. I think they've done an amazing job today. I've really enjoyed, and I always learn something whenever I do one of these policy conversations or engage with these three, and it's been lovely to see so many faces here today. Just two kind of final things from TASCOS. I'm exploring the notion of a community of practice around lived experience advocacy in the community services industry, because lots of people are thinking about it, and lots of us do seem to be recreating the wheel, trying to build our own things from scratch without sharing practice or collaborating. So I'm going to follow up in an email after this, and if you're interested, let me know. Consultation process out at the moment. Some of you may have received an email from me this morning with a survey asking for organisational input into the design of a community voice partnership program within TASCOS. This is me please asking you to take part in that if you would, and I'll send that round in the follow-up email as well. And there'll be a brief survey in the follow-up email, which just gives us feedback on the format of these policy conversations, and that helps us improve them for next time. So if you've got a couple of minutes, it would be great if you could do that too. A big round of applause for everyone who presented today, and for you all for taking your lunch break to be with us. Thanks, everybody.